The next item of business is Stage 1 debate on motion 20223 in the name of Christina McKelvey on the Female Genital Mutilation Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill. May I ask those who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Christina McKelvey to speak to and move the motion for up to 9 minutes, please, Minister.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I am very pleased to open this Stage 1 debate on the Female Genital Mutilation Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill. This is an important bill which will make a real difference to women and girls at risk of or who have experienced the abhorrent practice of FGM. As members know, the Equality Human Rights Committee published a Stage 1 report earlier this month, and that report gave unanimous support for the principles of the bill. I would like to thank the convener and members of the committee for their thoughtful and considered report. We responded quickly and positively to the report on the 11th of December, and I'm sure members have now had an opportunity to read through that response. Above all, Presiding Officer, I'd like to thank those organisations and experts who took the time to provide their invaluable perspective to the committee. It's incredibly valuable to have that lived experience. Like other forms of gender-based violence, FGM is a manifestation of power and a means of controlling the sexuality of women and girls. It's a form of violence against women. As the Minister responsible for the Scottish Government's work in this area, I am committed to preventing FGM in Scotland and ensuring that girls and women who are at risk of FGM are protected from harm. FGM has been illegal since 1985. What the Fgm Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill seeks to do is to add existing protections and improve the system response for women and girls at risk of harm. It is established that at least 200 million girls and women across 30 countries have been subject to FGM, and the prevalence of FGM in Scotland is difficult to estimate because of the hidden nature of the crime. A Scottish Refugee Council report in 2014 found that there are communities potentially affected by FGM in every local authority area in Scotland, with the largest communities in Glasgow, Aberdeen, Edinburgh and Dundee. So it's not a new issue, Presiding Officer, but this government has been taking action. In 2016, we published the National Action Plan to prevent and eradicate FGM in Scotland. The purpose of the National Action Plan is to foster an environment of prevention in Scotland and to improve the welfare and quality of life of FGM survivors. We are taking steps to engage with communities, raise awareness and improve the response of frontline services. And our work includes strengthening the existing legal protections at those of risk of FGM. This is what the Fgm Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill does. The bill creates a new specific FGM measure, a protection order, which means our public services and our courts are able to focus on the need to protect those persons at risk or those who have already suffered from FGM being carried out on them. Building on the experience in other jurisdictions in the UK and reflecting on the support in our consultation, this is an effective and proven approach to reducing the risk to potential victims. Under the bill, the Fgm protection orders will be made by a court and be unique to each case. The orders will contain conditions to protect girls and women from FGM, further and in addition to what their equivalent orders in the rest of the UK can already do. They will be able to be used by law enforcement agencies against those who wish to perpetrate this terrible crime, restricting their activities, even where no potential victim has been identified. To support the new protection order, the bill places a duty on ministers to issue statutory guidance on the protection orders and also a power to issue guidance on FGM more generally. Let me now turn to the committee's report, and that makes a number of points in their recommendations. The committee asked us to be mindful of the risk of racialisation and stigma in developing the guidance and training. I have been clear in rejecting the assertion that this bill racially profiles communities, although I do acknowledge the importance of being careful with language and the reality of stigma. The public bodies who are tasked with responding in this area are taking forward work to embed equality and diversity within their workforce, which will help to reduce that risk. We will work to ensure that guidance and training is shaped by the communities themselves and reflects the reality of FGM. Community engagement, Presiding Officer, was a very strong focus to the committee. It's absolutely critical for me. Nothing about us without us is my watchword here. So following royal assent, we will take forward a comprehensive programme of engagement with communities and stakeholders to shape that very guidance. Ensuring that support is available for women and girls who are at risk or who have experienced FGM was also identified as important within the report. We will work closely with COSLA to ensure that the clear information on the support available is included in the guidance. The third sector also has a critical role here, and we will continue to fund their work in that area. The committee notes the importance of education and links with the wider child protection system. That's absolutely correct. We are absolutely clear that FGM is a form of child abuse, and our National Child Protection Guidance for Scotland, which is being updated now to reflect this. In Scotland, in schools, the Scottish Government believes it is for teachers, schools and local authorities to determine how best to deliver learning and teaching on any topic and subject in line with Curriculum for Excellence. However, we do support our schools and teachers to deliver relevant and engaging learning. Earlier this year, we supported publication of an online teaching resource for relationships, sexual health and parenthood education. I have seen this excellent piece of work firsthand, and I would encourage all members to take a look at it. It's incredibly helpful. It includes content on FGM, which can be targeted at the early secondary school level. There is also material for the late primary school level to create the building blocks so that our young people can better understand what actually constitutes abuse. The committee considered additional provisions in the rest of the UK relating to anonymity for victims, a duty to notify, and the creation of a specific offence of failing to protect someone from FGM. I am pleased that the committee agreed with our assessment that inclusion of the duty to notify and failure to protect offence does not go into the bill. The committee did ask us to look at what more we can do around ensuring that those seeking anonymity in court can be granted it, and have undertaken to respond to that point before stage 2 arrives at the committee. Underlying so many issues we have discussed today is the need to ensure that people and communities play a central role in shaping the services, policies and statutory guidance. That is key for me as Minister. And as I've said, I am committed to taking forward a comprehensive programme of engagement and involvement as we implement this legislation. In this way, we can make sure that we do what actually helps prevent FGM, disrupt the activities of perpetrators, provide protections to those at risk, provide the support that's required, and, through participation, gives a voice to people and communities affected by this practice. Presiding Officer, the bill, alongside our action plan, therefore is the right mix of prevention and protection. I want to end my opening statement with a quote from someone called Waris Deary, a Somalian activist against FGM. She described her own terrible memory of undergoing FGM. And I quote her now: "Mama tied a blindfold over my eyes. The next thing I felt, my flesh was being cut away. I heard the blade sawing back and forth through my skin. The pain between my legs was so intense, I wished I would die." Presiding Officer, if this bill prevents just one person going through what Waris experienced, then it will be well worth it. I commend the general principles of the bill to our Parliament. Thank you.
Could you move the motion, please, Minister?
I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much. I now call on Ruth Maguire on behalf of the Equalities and Human Rights Committee for up to 7 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, over the past few months, the Equalities and Human Rights Committee heard from women's organisations, academics, midwives, educators, police and other professionals. We heard how the UK government and agencies handle FGM and about the interaction between protection orders and asylum and immigration. But the most powerful evidence in our scrutiny of the Female Genital Mutilation Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill came from our engagement with organisations, meeting with survivors and frontline workers. They told us the difference protection orders might make and how Scotland can better deal with and prevent FGM. I'd like to share some of their experience with the Chamber today. As part of our engagement, we worked with the outreach and engagement teams in the Parliament on a digital storytelling project. Through a series of workshops, women affected by FGM created short films of their experiences. This meant they could tell their story, their way, in a supported and safe environment. These digital stories are powerful and difficult viewing, and I urge those who want a greater understanding of FGM and the impact on women to view them. Presiding Officer, when we're talking about FGM, I don't particularly like the word story. It suggests fiction, it suggests a neat narrative and a happy ending. And for many of the women we met and heard from, neither of those is true. The situations where FGM is a threat can be complicated and complex. And if FGM seems far removed from those of us in the Chamber today, these digital stories show us it's a very real thing for some women in Scotland. In our evidence, we heard concerns about racialisation. We recognise those concerns and asked the Scottish Government to be mindful of this as they develop the statutory guidance around FGM. But we know from our evidence there's no one culture or community that practices FGM. It's found around the world and it is always a fundamental violation of human rights. FGM contravenes articles in the European Convention on Human Rights relating to cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment, and other human rights treaties, including the Convention Against Torture, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Presiding Officer, we are all entitled to the same human rights, but we recognise that when we try to realise them, we come from different starting points. For the women and girls facing the threat of FGM or dealing with the consequences of FGM, that starting point can seem a long way back. Through our work on human rights, we've learned the key to realising human rights is to take a person-centred approach. Put simply, as lawmakers, we must understand we all have different backgrounds and needs. For our laws to be good laws, we must put the individual at the centre and involve them in the process. The women who shared their digital stories want to be involved. They have lived experience and expertise. They must be at the centre of the work on this bill going forward. And what did women tell us they needed? At the Women's Support Project in Glasgow, Mary Fee and I heard from women about the struggles they faced finding suitable healthcare. One of the women said that she felt like she stood out in her hijab and was embarrassed to be there in the sexual health clinic. Women wanted to speak to someone who understood their experiences in a supportive environment. They wanted help and support to be available, and not just through maternity services. We welcome the commitment from the Scottish Government to look at this further. At the multicultural family base in Leith, Oliver Mundell and I heard about a woman who'd come to Scotland with her children and husband on a temporary visa. During their time in Scotland, they had a daughter. The family were now due to return to their home country, where the girl would face FGM. The mother didn't want this to happen. Her options were to return to her home country, where her daughter would be cut, or she could seek asylum in Scotland. Her choice becomes less of a choice the more we understand what it actually means. As an asylum seeker, she would be in Scotland with her children, but without her husband. She feared she would be disowned by her family. She would be relocated from Edinburgh to Glasgow, far from the community and connections that she'd made. She would face poverty and uncertainty in the name of protecting her child. We were asked how a protection order would help this woman. Would it assist her asylum case? Would it give her time and space to assess her options? Would it provide housing for her and her children? Answers to these questions will be key to the success of this bill. As a committee, we agree with the general principles of the bill. We welcome anything that can provide additional protection to those facing the harm of FGM, and we heard from witnesses these protection orders would do that. But from women and communities, we heard their need for support. Legislation in isolation will not stop FGM in Scotland. For this bill to work, we must look at the support women need, and we should put them at the heart of developing it. That's how we ensure this bill makes meaningful change for women and girls. Presiding Officer, I'd like to finish with a plea from one of the digital stories created by all the women together as they were reflecting on their thoughts and hopes for the bill. They told us, "Do not doubt stories about FGM. They are real. We want our thoughts and our voices to be heard in our own words. We want change, and we hope our experience can help bring this change about." On behalf of the committee, I offer my sincere thanks to all those who gave evidence, shared their experience, and helped us form our conclusions. We believe this bill is an opportunity to create a new chapter in the story. We urge the Scottish Government to ensure this is truly person-centred legislation. As the Minister told us, nothing about us without us. Make these women the leading roles, not the supporting actors. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the Equalities and Human Rights Committee supports the general principles of the Female Genital Mutilation Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill.
And I call on Annie Wells for up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. We welcome the publication of the Female Genital Mutilation Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill and today's debate. FGM is a form of violence against women and girls, and it's a violation of their human rights. FGM describes all procedures involving partial or total removal of the external female genitalia or other injury to the female genital organs for non-medical reasons. It's mostly carried out soon after birth or as a young girl, or occasionally it involves adult women. Because FGM is carried out at a at different ages, it can be difficult to identify when a girl faces an imminent risk of FGM. There are no health benefits of FGM. It's likely to cause both short-term and long-term physical and psychological harm. The procedure can cause serious injuries, including severe bleeding, problems urinating, cysts, infections, and potentially complications in childbirth. And as we've heard, more than 200 million girls and women alive today have suffered from FGM. Thankfully, the practice is far from the norm in Scotland and the UK. But we should still send a clear message about how wrong the practice is and do whatever we can to prevent it. Scotland has developed specific legislation and policy on FGM. We have a broad range of tools to help support and protect women and girls who have been subject to FGM. FGM has been a criminal offence in the UK for 34 years, since 1985. In the rest of the UK, the FGM Act 2003 repealed and reenacted the 1985 Act, and the FGM Act 2005 carried out the same functions in Scotland. The Act made it an offence to have FGM carried out abroad, and it increased the maximum penalty to 14 years imprisonment. The 2005 Act also changed the terminology from circumcision to FGM. To date, there have been no criminal prosecutions brought in Scotland, either under the 1985 Act or the 2005 Act. There could be many reasons behind the lack of prosecutions. There is no doubt that for some people it's difficult to challenge family members. In some cases, there may not be enough evidence to prosecute. And sometimes professionals may be reluctant to speak out on what they mistakenly believe is a cultural or religious practice. We welcome the publication of the bill in today's debate. We are firmly behind the principal aim of the bill to strengthen legal protection for women and girls who could be at risk. The bill aims to make provisions for Fgm Protection Orders. They are a form of civil order that can impose conditions or requirements on a person. The protection orders aim to protect a person from FGM and to safeguard people from harm if FGM has already happened. And while we firmly back the principles of the bill, in some areas we believe a further look is needed. As the Minister said, we believe there needs to be more work done around victim anonymity. In their evidence, Police Scotland highlighted that there may be a need for automatic anonymity for anyone coming forward. They said there can be difficulty when dealing with incidents of FGM because victims have an inherent fear of repercussions. And without protection of automatic anonymity, the police said that there may be a barrier to people reporting this crime. And I am pleased to hear the Minister commit to come back to us before stage 2 of the bill on that. They also suggested this could be mitigated by the inclusion of FGM in the Vulnerable Witnesses Criminal Evidence Scotland Bill. That would see all victims of FGM having access to non-standard special measures, for instance, the use of a prior statement or providing evidence on commission. We also believe that more work needs to be done to remove barriers for those seeking help with FGM protection orders, for example, through the legal aid process. As the Law Society of Scotland said in their evidence, there are substantial implications of the bill. For instance, there are issues to consider involving raising awareness of FGM, an unacceptable practice within communities in Scotland. The Law Society feels that those at risk may not speak English as their first language, so they may experience problems communicating and understanding. Yeah, absolutely.
Elaine Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Thank the member for taking an intervention. I wondered if she would also consider putting an argument to colleagues at Westminster about the fact that FGM really does need to be considered seriously with regard to asylum seekers. I think that's an important point that ought to be made.
Annie Wills.
Yeah, and I think I would be happy to write to the Secretary of State regarding that, just to see what their process is going to be going forward, because I know we received communication back to the committee, but I will certainly happily write to the Secretary of State on that as well, just to get further clarifications to how we can make sure that we are looking after these vulnerable women. And finally, we believe that there needs to be a look again at working with the frontline health workers to understand how data around FGM can be better recorded. The General Medical Council support the bill and recognise that the role doctors and other healthcare professionals can play. As part of this, they state that any statutory guidance should provide detail on additional responsibilities for healthcare workers. In summary, Presiding Officer, while we feel a further look is needed at some areas, the Scottish Conservatives support the broad principles of the bill. Clearly, FGM is an abhorrent practice that must be rooted out. We will support proposals that support victims of this crime, and we hope this bill can prevent FGM happening in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call on Elaine Smith to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to be opening for the Labour Party in this debate, particularly as I have a history of involvement with legislating on FGM in this Parliament. And I thank the Cabinet Secretary for bringing forward this welcome addition to improve the already existing laws to prevent and eradicate, or to try to prevent and eradicate FGM. I also thank the committee for the work, and my committee colleague Mary Fee will be expanding more on that when she speaks. As FGM survivor Nene Bojang from Edinburgh said of this new bill, I was just 9 years old when I was subjected to FGM. It was excruciating and has caused me pain throughout my life. If this bill prevents even just one woman from going through the same, then in my eyes it will be a success. I served on the Equal Opportunities Committee when the Labour-led administration brought forward the Prohibition of Female Genital Mutilation Scotland Act in 2005, and at that time we heard harrowing testimony from women who'd been subjected to this horrendous acts of violence, and they carried the scars and the health problems for the rest of their lives. I was the committee's gender reporter, and I met privately at that time with Somalian women out in the community. They were keen to share their experience, their medical problems, their trauma and their suggestions, but not to do so publicly. I think that's something that we really must reflect on. Therefore, in order to hear from them on the record at that time, the committee met in public, but the witnesses giving evidence were protected and given anonymity, and that was quite a groundbreaking way to gather the invaluable evidence, experiences and opinions to shape our legislation in this Parliament. There are really no words to describe how barbaric this procedure is, usually performed in small girls without anaesthesia and little or no hygiene, and often it can be fatal. From evidence gathering at the time, members of the Somali Women's Action Group could not believe that what we deemed to be a criminal offence against a UK national or permanent resident was not an offence against asylum seeker women and children at that time. My own amendments to the bill shaped the eventual legislation, and it became a criminal offence to have FGM carried out in Scotland or abroad against all women and girls. Turning to the situation in 2019, the WHO still estimates that more than 200 million girls and women alive today have undergone the practice, and that every year 3 million girls are at risk of undergoing FGM. Unfortunately, we don't have, I think, available data for Scotland as to the actual incidence of FGM. The Scottish Refugee Council, however, has estimated that around 24,000 men, women and children living in Scotland were born in a country where FGM is practised to some extent. Progress has been made on global efforts to eliminate FGM and, excuse me, Presiding Officer, thank you. And a girl is about 1/3 less likely to be cut than she was 30 years ago, and that's still far too many. And before we become complacent, UNICEF warns that population growth means that by 2030, more than 1 in 3 girls worldwide will be born in the 30 countries where FGM is most prevalent. So that will mean 68 million more girls at risk, which is quite alarming. Another worrying trend has been the medicalisation of FGM, where medical professionals normalise the practice by claiming safer methods make it acceptable. So they may argue that this is damage limitation, but it's still damage, and it goes against the ethics of the medical profession, and I don't think there's any justification. I think it's also important to note that there's not a religious requirement for this in any country or culture. However, it is a sensitive issue, and we must not stigmatise the communities where it is thought that women and girls are at high risk of FGM. The University of Bristol has recently worked together with the Somali community just this year, and the report produced is instructive. Safeguarding services already in place in England were found to be stigmatising and traumatising. The families who participated were already committed to eradicating FGM, and they found statutory approaches could be offensive and traumatic, especially considering that some of the mothers were also victims of FGM. School referrals led to unannounced home visits by social services and uniformed police officers.
We must not repeat these mistakes here. These are issues that really need consideration, but there are also other issues. For example, midwives, like most of the professions who are key in the fight to eradicate and to help to eradicate Fgm and to deal with the issues of Fgm, are struggling due to funding cuts. The RCM noted its significant concern at the 26.5% vacant posts in midwifery and nursing. So if we're adding extra responsibility to teachers, medical practitioners, social workers and police, we cannot ignore vacant places, shrinking numbers and cuts to service. Presiding Officer, I'll just finish with this. A new strategy is definitely needed. In February 2019, we saw the first person in England found guilty of Fgm. There have been no prosecutions in Scotland, and we know that doesn't mean that Fgm isn't being practised. So, I welcome a strategy of prevention and protection, which must always avoid stigmatising and persecuting vulnerable members of our community. I look forward to following the passage of the legislation, and on behalf of Scottish Labour, I support the Government motion.
Thank you very much. And I call on Patrick Harvey to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And in opening a speech in a debate like this, quite often it's the norm to thank the committee for its work. That's particularly important in my situation for a political party that doesn't have a member on the lead committee. It's always an extra challenge to try to get to grips with the work that's been done. Usually the challenges are around the complexity of legislation. This isn't complex legislation, but it's legislation that raises highly complex issues. And the lived experience of the survivors of Fgm, which I think all of us would recognise are difficult to learn about. And so I particularly want to thank the committee for the work that it's done in producing the report. The purposes that we should have are clearly twofold, and I think that's recognised in the legislation as well as in the wider work that the government has undertaken on this issue. Partly, it is to protect from the risk, protect women and girls from the risk that Fgm would be perpetrated against them, but also to provide safeguarding and support for those who have already come through that experience, for survivors of Fgm. And in both those purposes, looking at those who are at risk and those who are in need of support, there are complex issues that arise in terms of identifying those individuals who are in need or who are at risk. And I think the issue of racialisation, which the Minister touched on in the opening speech, is one of the first areas of complexity. And it gives rise to the overwhelming need to emphasise support and training for the kind of people working in settings where they may have concerns. And many people may have concerns but feel uncertain how exactly to express those concerns without feeling that they're at risk of stigmatising people in terms of racial groups or religious groups. And I think the committee's evidence reflects the balance of views on that difficult point as well. The need to be conscious of the risk of racialisation in the approach to this issue, but the need for that not to become a barrier to taking the action that is necessary. So I'm pleased that the committee has taken the time to consider that and has asked the Scottish Government to develop guidance and training. And I think that need for guidance and training is one of the themes that for me has come through many aspects of the report as well. Elaine Smith talked about asylum seekers and refugees, and the committee's report does recognise the particular challenges in relation to asylum seekers and refugees. The lack of protection available through the asylum system, the failure to recognise within the asylum system that women may have been unable to relocate from one part of their country of origin to another in order to escape the risk of Fgm, and the culture of disbelief that exists within the asylum system. That's clear throughout the whole of the asylum system, where overwhelmingly applicants for asylum are treated as guilty, assumption of guilt until innocence is proved. The absolute opposite of the way the asylum system ought to work. But where we're talking about a complex, sensitive and difficult issue to express, such as Fgm, the risk of it or the experience of having gone through it or having family members who have gone through it, that culture of disbelief must be an insurmountable hurdle for a great many people in the asylum system, even to begin talking about these issues, or to know who they can trust within the asylum system. Yes, indeed.
Jane Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank Patrick Harvey for giving way. Would the member also agree that language could be an issue as well in explaining?
Patrick Harvey.
Undoubtedly, undoubtedly. And I think the language barrier is one of the biggest reasons why natural justice is so frequently failed within the asylum system, but particularly in relation to the issues that would need to be talked about in relation to FGM. It's a whole other level of language barrier that I think many people wouldn't even have considered if they weren't already closely familiar with the subject. I was interested as well to note that in perhaps a smaller section of the report, it mentions the fact that the WHO definition of FGM includes genital piercings. And again, a different professional setting in which people working in those settings may not consider themselves as people who need to understand or know about FGM as a wider issue, and where definitions would be very different. I'm sure we wouldn't want to approach that issue in the sense of trying to forbid or ban body modification practices that are taken as a choice by empowered individuals who are adults. But the fact that there is an ambiguity about the definition there gives rise to another level of complexity that may be difficult to pin down in law, the distinction between those who do take an empowered and informed decision as adults and those who are under cultural or coercive pressure or an expectation to undergo procedures that are not genuinely for their choice. Finally, Presiding Officer, all of these issues, all of them raise the importance of support and training again. And so I was interested that the committee was open to the idea of renaming the orders to include the phrase protection and support order. And I think that the government has, I think, considered whether it's going to be willing to look at that as the bill goes forward. Because training, support and the support services that we put around this legislation are at least as important as the legislation itself. That being said, the legislation is greatly valued and I hope that it will pass unanimously tonight.
Thank you. And I call on Alex Cole-Hamilton to be followed by Angela Constance.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I start by echoing thanks already offered to my fellow members of the committee, to the clerks and indeed, most importantly, to the witnesses who gave us a real education in this area, this very important area. I thank the Scottish Government very much for bringing forward this legislation and rise to speak in full-throated support on behalf of myself and of my parliamentary colleagues of this legislation, what will become a very essential piece of legislation. As Vice Convener of the Equality and Human Rights Committee, it was a really important and sensitive topic. There were issues that challenged us and there were issues that surprised us. But I recognise, I think, that the tone this afternoon has been one of consensus, and I hope that this will be met with the entirety of the passage of this legislation through this Parliament, because it should command our consensus at every stage. And it demonstrates that it is clearly a subject that unites us all. It's a bill, or rather, when it becomes an act, it will not affect many people, and that is to be welcomed. It is a welcome reality. Nevertheless, the fact that we need to have this debate and this legislation at the end of the second decade of the 21st century is an indictment of where we still need to get to in terms of our global efforts towards modernity and the empowerment of women. Female genital mutilation is a clear manifestation of a patriarchal attempt to control and possess women. It's about men's power over women, and the victims of FGM are likely to experience short and long-term physical and psychological harm. And every year, nearly 3 million girls and young women are subject to acts of brutality and mutilation in the name of culture and of tradition. I want to take this opportunity to pay tribute to my colleague and former leader Jo Swinson, who strived throughout her parliamentary career towards the empowerment of women. And during the week of UN International Day of Zero Tolerance for FGM, Jo revealed this year the new statistics which show that health boards continue treating women experiencing FGM in some of Scotland's biggest cities like Glasgow and in Edinburgh. FGM is not only a cruel and traumatic practice, which should be eradicated, but an indication of a deep-rooted gender inequality which still prevails. I welcome the bill's aim to strengthen the legal protection for women and girls at risk of FGM, and already illegal practice effectively, and early interventions are key. However, it's not always possible. Therefore, I fully support the introduction of the new protection orders, which, in the words of Lethan Bartholomew from the National FGM Centre, give women the, and I quote, agency and the power not only to take a stance and protect herself, but also to protect her child. Protection orders, presiding officer, enable a preventative approach to be taken to avoid harm to a child or for them to be removed from the UK. During the stage 1 consideration, a parallel was drawn between the creation of risk of sexual harm orders in the Children and Prevention of Sexual Offences Act and those of FGM protection orders. This parallel relates to the application of the proposed law and how often these might be used. Although the Sexual Offences Act came into force more than 10 years ago, the number of RSHOs that have been handed down or applied through the courts can be counted on one hand. It is a salutary lesson for this bill. Therefore, for this act to be effective and preventative, then we need to work together to develop effective guidance and awareness around FGM protection orders to ensure that the additional measures are in place for the police, the judiciary and all other stakeholders. I do also worry that this bill does not, unlike the United Kingdom's Parliament recent Serious Crime Act in 2015, include provisions for lifelong anonymity of victims of FGM. I'm not persuaded it's entirely justifiable to exclude this provision from our bill, and I'll perhaps work with us to test that at stage 2, because I don't believe that our justice system is materially different from the UK justice system. Both Police Scotland and the Equality Commission advocate anonymity in legislation and reference the difficulty in evidencing incidents of FGM due to fear of repercussions. Police Scotland state the anonymity would encourage women and girls to come forward and protect individuals without protection of automatic anonymity. There remains a barrier to such reporting. I will.
Ruth McGuire.
Hamilton for taking intervention. I just wonder if you would reflect on, I hear what he's saying about anonymity and we share some opinions on that. Anonymity for all victims of all sexual crimes might persuade more women to come forward. I wonder if that thing is bigger than just this bill and maybe it needs to be dealt with elsewhere.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I think the convener of our committee makes a valid point, a very reasonable point. And like I say, I'm not wedded to amendment at stage 2, but I think it's something we need to have perhaps a wider discussion in the context of all sexual crime. And I absolutely take her intervention in the spirit in which it was offered. Finally, I'm glad that this bill is grounded in a rights-based approach. All of our bills should be, with its policy firmly rooted in Article 24 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which calls for the prohibition of all traditional practices that are detrimental to the health and well-being of women. I'm firmly of the belief that when we fully incorporate the UNCRC into Scots law, as this government is prepared to do, that we will finally make rights real in that context. And in striving to be a human rights leader, we must act now, as we cannot lead the world from the back of the pack on children's rights. Government, Parliament and community leaders within our society all have a central role to play in the matter, but it's also about public participation and challenging arcane, brutal traditions, abandoning certain attitudes towards the education of girls. As we have heard, there are challenges in respect of terminology, but embarrassment should not prevent us from discussing the issue for whatever reason. And to make real progress, we need to talk about these issues, to bring them forward, encourage others to do so, and to move forward in the atmosphere of consensus that we have displayed today. And we support the bill.
Thank you very much. We move now to the open debate. I would encourage all members to keep their remarks to 5 minutes or less. Angela Constance to be followed by Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I only joined the Equalities and Human Rights Committee in September, and it's been a pleasure to serve on it because all members, under the quiet but nonetheless determined stewardship of the convener Ruth McGuire, come to committee with a deep commitment to a fairer Scotland, but also with a very genuine desire to work together. And this has been evident in our scrutiny of the Female Genital Mutilation Bill, which led to the presentation of a unanimous Stage 1 report to the Government. And I'm pleased that the Minister's response to committee has been equally collaborative. As we know, FGM is illegal, and the purpose of this bill is to update and strengthen protection for women and girls at risk of this practice by creating new protection orders and putting guidance on a statutory footing. FGM is a fundamental violation of human rights. It's a manifestation of deep-rooted gender inequality. It's a breach of international law and causes short and long-term physical and psychological harm, and there are absolutely no health benefits from it. The bill was widely supported by stakeholders, but crucially it was informed by the lived experience of survivors. And Elaine Smith powerfully quoted earlier the testimony, the personal testimony of Nineve Bojang. And as the Minister said in her opening remarks, if this bill prevents even just one woman from going through the trauma of FGM, it will have been worthwhile. And it is crucial, Presiding Officer, that the voices and the testimony of women and their communities is at the very heart of engagement and the development of statutory guidance in particular. The experts are those with lived experience, and we need to make an enduring commitment to survivors that participation and engagement is ongoing and not a one-off event. And this approach is absolutely essential to minimise the risk of stigmatisation and even racialisation as expressed by some committee witnesses. And in her evidence to committee, the Minister and the convener in her opening remarks today rightly state that FGM has been practised across many countries, many continents and communities and belief systems for about 5,000 years, and it is indeed a global issue. One of the many complex issues that committee wrestled with was the lifelong automatic anonymity for survivors. And there were mixed views about this, and at present in Scotland, these matters are decided by the courts on a case-by-case basis. But after much thought and deliberation, committee concluded that it is the views and wishes of individual survivors in individual cases that should be paramount and central to court considerations. And I know the Minister, along with other matters, made a commitment to reflect and come back before stage 2. There was also an acceptance that, based on the evidence heard and received by committee and not politics, that this legislation should be different to what exists south of the border. And again, there was a cross-party concern about the lack of consistency in the treatment and consideration of FGM within the asylum system, therefore leading to a lack of protection for women in the asylum system. Again, points made by both Elaine Smith and Patrick Harvey. And collectively, the Equalities and Human Rights Committee, I believe, has worked very hard to both test and tease out the added value of this bill, given that FGM is currently illegal, there are existing child protection measures, there are a national action plan to prevent and eradicate FGM, and a very honest reflection that legislation alone is rarely a silver bullet, particularly for crimes that are often hidden. But when you consider the need to protect women and girls of all ages, to better support 16 and 17-year-olds who are not always captured by the children's hearing system, and the need to build quite bespoke measures for both protection and support, I believe the case for this legislation is very well made. So I want to say well done to the Minister on what I believe is her first bill in her current role, and I want to thank her team and also the committee clerks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I call Maurice Corrie to be followed by Mary Fee.
Thank you, Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the publishing of this bill today, and it is my pleasure to speak in this debate. Female genital mutilation, or FGM, otherwise known as, is a pervasive form of gender-based violence that millions of women and girls in the world face. And as we know, it is recognised internationally as a gross infringement upon their human rights, and steps must be taken to prevent and eliminate this practice. In 2011, it was found that around 24,000 individuals living in Scotland were born in countries that practice some form of FGM, and from 2001 to 2012, 2,750 girls were born in Scotland to women from these communities. Even with this data, it is still not known how many people within these communities are directly affected. By nature, FGM is a matter of hidden complexities. It makes it difficult to create a solution that adequately addresses such harms in order to prevent them and support those already impacted. Current legislation provides a broad range of policy and tools to help support the victims and survivors of FGM. And in 2005, the Prohibition of Female Genital Mutilation Act was introduced, which increased the maximum penalty to 14 years of imprisonment and changed the terminology from mutilation to circumcision. This removed any possible justification for execution of such an act, and the aim was to ensure that the legal protection in Scotland was equal to that of the rest of the UK. Additionally, the National Action Plan to tackle FGM was implemented in 2016. It introduced measures to train staff of statutory agencies on FGM, such as how to talk to survivors, how to identify those with an imminent risk of FGM, and those on which it had already been performed, and strengthening information sharing on FGM. These steps have opened up the conversation concerning FGM and how to effectively tackle it. This new bill crucially builds upon this already existing legislation as a step further in protecting the rights of women and girls by enabling individuals to obtain a Female Genital Mutilation Protection Order, or FGM-PO. Those at risk can be provided with a proactive means of protecting themselves or their daughters from FGM. I am totally supportive of the legislative steps towards this bill which it makes. But there are areas which require further examination and discussion as the bill advances. The ability to obtain a specific FGM-PO is a helpful approach, but we must consider the process behind acquiring the protective order. Because of the nature of the FGM-PO within the legal system, access to legal advice and assistance would be advantageous to ensure an accurate and successful application. This raises a number of concerns regarding barriers that will impede those who need it most from acquiring this integral protection. We need to consider how accessible the legal system will be for those most at risk. As many of them come from different countries, our legal system may be understandably overwhelming and confusing. Legal aid will provide them with an invaluable guide to successfully negotiate a system that may be unfamiliar and daunting. Secondly, the ability to pay for the national legal aid is also important. Not all FGM-PO applicants will be eligible for legal aid, and some women will simply be unable to afford it. No woman or girl should be put at such devastating risk because of the lack of financial resources. We must take note of these barriers and consider how they can be removed to ensure that individuals can navigate applying for and acquiring an FGM-PO in a timely manner. Enacting legislation does no good if it is unable to help those most in need. Yes, certainly. Minister.
I wonder if Maurice Corrie would then join with me, because I intend to write to the UK Government on all of these measures. But some of the issues that he raises in his speech there is around about how the asylum system works along with protection orders, and would he support the calls from this place that some of that be devolved to here so that we can deal with it here? But also, can he take on board the issue we've got round about no recourse to public funds and how some women are affected by that too?
Maurice Corrie.
I thank the Minister for her intervention, and I totally understand what you're saying, but I think we must look at things in individual cases, and not everyone is the same. But certainly we will be, as my colleague here, Annie Wells, has just said, we will be taking up issues which Elaine Smith brought up and writing to the UK Parliament. And I'm sure in discussions with Annie, we'll look at some of these issues concerned. But you raise a very important point, and yes, we will certainly consider that. In addition to eliminating the barriers to acquiring a protective order, the question concerning the anonymity of victims must also be fully examined. While it is not currently included in this bill, it is a subject which should be carefully considered and further explored in relation to how we can most effectively provide support to FGM victims. Because of the hidden and private nature of FGM, the most effective way to identify victims and obtain evidence is from the victims themselves. And every step, Presiding Officer, must be taken to ensure that these women and girls feel comfortable and confident in being able to report their experiences and being protected from the possible associated repercussions. Whether this means automatic or anonymity by being granted, or that victims are provided with a clear and assured path of gaining anonymity, which has already been talked about at their request, all options must be considered, and the concerns and wishes of the victims must be central in consideration of decisions taken. And in closing, Presiding Officer, the new measures introduced by this bill have the potential to bring about necessary change, and in order for change to be as effective as possible, we must consider and eliminate all possible barriers. And these measures, when coupled with robust education and training, will do much to demonstrate the ongoing commitment that Scotland is taking to eliminate FGM practices. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on Mary Fee to be followed by James Dornan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by thanking the Scottish Government for bringing this bill to the Parliament for consideration. And my thanks are also extended to the witnesses, including women and girls affected by FGM, who assisted the committee during a Stage 1 inquiry. And without their input, it is difficult to fully understand the effects and the harm that FGM causes. And their evidence to us was invaluable. FGM is rightly illegal. However, consideration must be given to how we can prevent it, and that's what this bill aims to achieve. And I fully support the aims to strengthen the protection for women and girls who are at risk of female genital mutilation. And, Presiding Officer, female genital mutilation is not limited to any race, to any religion or to any country. And it is believed to have occurred for over 5,000 years across the world and across religions. And we were told during our evidence sessions that it has been performed in adherence to religion, in adherence to cultural traditions and as a rite of passage. It does not benefit women and girls in any way. It leads to lifelong physical and mental health problems, and it is a form of abuse and control. And I understand the government's and some witnesses' position in relation to racial profiling. However, I do think there must be clear guidance and training to ensure that no person feels stigmatised or criminalised. And I welcome the comments made by the Minister in her opening remarks on how this piece of work will be taken forward. We heard during our evidence sessions on medical services that NHS Lothian applied a policy of universal inquiry. However, this is not seen in other parts of the country. And to prevent people feeling targeted because of their race or their religion, there must be a universal policy for all public services that deals with justice and women's sexual, mental and medical health. And in relation to guidance and training on reaching out to women and girls, there must also be wider training and education, and this is backed up by experts who provided evidence to the committee. And on education in schools, which is crucially important, I back calls for FGM to be consistently taught in schools to both boys and girls. And schools now include human rights education. And as this is a human rights violation, this allows schools to better educate around the issue of FGM. And the Scottish Government in its response says that FGM is covered from S1 and abuse and being protected from abuse is covered at P5. But I do wonder if there is scope for the specific issue of FGM that could be covered at an earlier stage, particularly if girls are a target for FGM prior to starting puberty and their teenage years. I do accept that there may be concerns around the age and stage of children when discussing the issue of FGM, but I wonder if perhaps the Minister could consider that either in a response in closing tonight or at a later stage. And it is very important that men are also taught about the dangers and lifelong consequences of FGM. And there is an issue around this discussed in the Stage 1 report. And our report says that the role of boys and men in FGM conversations was also raised by the men at Community InfoSource. Men said that they were not aware of FGM happening in their own communities or their own families until they attended workshops with Community InfoSource. And it is evident that such workshops are fundamental in the pursuit to eradicate FGM. And, Presiding Officer, I fully support the introduction of the Fgm Protection Orders, and they will play an integral part in protecting and supporting women and girls from FGM. and hopefully eradicate its practice in Scotland, and for those living in Scotland, including, as has been previously mentioned, asylum seekers, and this is a crucial issue for me. Anne Spears, the Deputy Chief Executive Officer from Multicultural Family Base, rightly suggested that the word support be added to the orders. And support is an integral aspect in tackling FGM and helping victims. And it is right that the Scottish Government speak with stakeholders while considering the recommendation. And I do hope that they do this. However, with or without the term support included, the orders will serve the same purpose. And I wanted to touch on anonymity, but I see we are short of time. But can I just say that I'm grateful for the comments that have been made by the Minister about the intention to look at this issue and come back to committee prior to stage 2. And, Presiding Officer, can I finish by once again thanking the women and girls who so openly and honestly spoke to us and shared their experiences. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call on James Dornan to be followed by Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have a members' debate tonight on a completely different type of abuse on women, financial coercive control. But female genital mutilation has always struck me as a particularly brutal and extremely harmful type of abuse. Some religious sects call this practice sunnah and refer to FGM as a religious cleansing. However, as has been said before, the practice is strongly condemned in all religions. In fact, the ritual of FGM predates any particular religion. As Annie Wells said earlier on, performing FGM has zero health benefits and is physically and psychologically damaging to women and young girls. Those who have been victims of FGM can suffer a multitude of consequences such as infections, urinary tract infection, menstruation problems, no sexual desire, pain during sex, complication in childbirth, and unfortunately on some occasions even death. There's no acceptable justification for this. And I commend the Equality and Human Rights Committee, led by my colleague Ruth Maguire, for spearheading efforts to update Scottish action on this intolerable and senseless abuse towards women and girls. The World Health Organization estimates that more than 200 million women and girls alive today have undergone FGM in one of its many forms. They also estimate that every year a further 3 million girls are at risk of undergoing female genital mutilation. And whilst the rates of female genital mutilation in Scotland are unknown, the NHS records patients where they can who have undergone it. In 2017 and 2018, NHS Lothian identified women with FGM on at least 93 occasions, and in the same amount of time, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde identified 138. That's at least 231 women too many who have received this horrendous treatment. As FGM is illegal in Scotland, young Scottish girls are often taken abroad on summer holidays without knowledge of the real reason for their travel. These procedures are usually performed using traditional methods with no anaesthetics or antiseptics, and often by someone who has no professional medical expertise. Genital mutilation is traumatic, often carried out with knives, scissors, glass shards, or razor blades. It's often, normally, non-consensual, and I cannot begin to imagine what nightmares these women and girls endure as they are physically restrained and subject to tortuous procedures. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Parliament has got an admirable record in this. They've been fighting against FGM for some time. But I'm proud to say that the Scots have been at the forefront against this barbaric practice for almost a century. Dr. John Arthur, a missionary from Glasgow, campaigned in 1929 to stop the Kikuyu in Kenya from carrying out this practice. He recognised that the senseless suffering women endured through clitoridectomy had no basis in Christianity and that it should not be tolerated. He encouraged those baptised Kikuyu to urge the Kikuyu Central Association to end the practice. He campaigned so vigorously in this matter to the point that he resigned from the Legislative Council and also saw his personal reputation being traduced by the British and church authorities because of his passion to protect these women and girls. And at the same time, his fellow missionary, Marion Stevenson from Forfar, introduced the term sexual mutilation of women. She also taught Rahili Warigia, who, along with other Tumu women, formed an organisation called the Shield of Young Girls to protect girls from FGM. The group wrote, "People are being caught like sheep. One should be allowed to follow her own way of either agreeing to be circumcised or not without being dictated on one's own body." I think we could all agree with that. Stevenson saw FGM as part of a concerted attack on women's rights and used FGM as a focal point that she could campaign to expand women's rights, such as establishing girls' schools, which among the basic subjects also taught domestic sciences, hygiene, as well as training many teachers and working in hospitals. This clearly demonstrated to her that in many cultures, FGM forms part of the fight to curtail women's societal rights. This bill strengthens the current legislation and delivers on the promises made in the Scottish Government's National Action Plan to prevent and eradicate FGM. And although FGM is a hidden and deeply complicated problem, we all, the Scottish Government and the rest of us, must play our part in being vigilant in our efforts to eradicate it. It is clear there is no complacency in the Government's approach to the fight to bring this abuse towards women to an end. This bill is an important part of that fight, and that is why I support the general principles of the bill at stage 1. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Michelle Ballantyne to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There is no justification for female genital mutilation. No religion condones it, and there are no health benefits. Its practice is violent and a barbaric assault against women and girls. During a debate in November 2017, I recounted my first encounter with FMG. I was a student nurse at the time, and the patient was herself a victim of FMG who had given birth to a daughter and had then begged us not to discharge her. Her husband planned to take their child straight to the airport, whereupon she would be taken out of the UK and that perfect little girl would then undergo female genital mutilation. Back then, there was nothing that we could do. We delayed her discharge as long as we could, but eventually we had to let her go. And I had the job of carrying that baby down to the car alongside her distraught mother. Presiding Officer, it is an experience that I have never forgotten. And in summing up for my party on that debate, I said that I hope the Cabinet Secretary had listened to the comments in the debate and that she would take forward some of the actions to ensure that Scotland followed the UK's decision to enact FMG protection orders. It is therefore extremely welcome that this Parliament is now debating stage 1 of this bill, and I personally thank the Minister and the Cabinet Secretary for making good on the promises to take this forward. The creation of FMG protection orders is an important milestone in development of legislation to prevent this foul practice. In this respect, Scotland has lagged somewhat behind England, Wales and Northern Ireland, all of which introduced FMG protection orders in 2015 as part of the Serious Crime Act. That said, there have been concerns raised about the need for specific protection orders. It was noted in some consultation responses that FGM protection orders were not always, FMG protection orders were not always the best instruments to counter this issue. While I agree with some of what the Law Society and SCRA's views said, that existing legislation does cover these offences, I nevertheless think that the right decision has been made to introduce a specific protection order. Not only does it signal intent, it deals with what is a very complex and problematic area of society and criminal law, and it can provide an immediate intervention to prevent a crime occurring. However, given the impact that these orders can have on families, particularly when strong personal relationships and high levels of familiar influence are at play, these orders are not enough on their own and should not be seen as the solution to every instance when a case of potential FMG is reported. FGM, sorry, I keep muddling my words. As Ruth Maguire described in her contribution, the order may provide protection, but it will not address the cultural and family ties that accompany the practice. A stronger framework and increased duty on professionals to report such crimes can only serve to help tackle this hidden crime. And data collection is also key. The evidence clearly shows this. As a spokesman for NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde admitted this year, we don't have confirmation that it is being practiced in Scotland, and the Scottish Government also said there are no clear and robust figures for the prevalence of the practice in Scotland because of the hidden nature of the crime. Yet we know there are cases, as hospital records clearly demonstrate so. We can introduce all the legislation we want, but unless we improve our methods of identifying and reporting suspected instances of this crime, we will continue in the same blind spot created by the 1985 Act, where young women were coming to hospitals with clear signs of mutilation without a single case being successfully prosecuted. So I do believe that SCRA's view to favour strong statutory guidance for professionals working with young people who are at risk is important, And we have seen in England and Wales that although social and healthcare professionals are obliged to report incidences to the police when it involves individuals under 18, many of these staff do still not fully understand the implications of the Serious Crime Act and the duty it bestows upon them. Without these people taking the first steps, protection orders will do the victims little good. While I very much welcome the publication of the multi-agency guidance published by the Scottish Government, the onus is still on getting the guidance right as a key to eradicating female genital mutilation in Scotland. Efforts must also be made to ensure that guidance does not simply gather dust on local authority office shelves. Rather, it must be embedded in the minds of frontline workers who are best placed to identify girls at risk, understand the family dynamics, and act quickly and effectively to avoid a potential offence. Underpinning all of this is, however, I believe, the absolute need to ensure that witnesses and potential victims will be given anonymity. And I do agree with some of the conversation that that should be lifelong, because the fear and distress women and girls experience must not be underestimated. And this is often compounded where English may not be their first language, and cultural pressures are significant. In closing today, I absolutely welcome the consensus that I've heard in this chamber. The message we are sending in taking this bill forward is that female genital mutilation is not a subject we are divided on. It is cruel, it is abhorrent, and no society should ever allow it to be carried on. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on Rona Mackay before we move to closing speeches. Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I warmly welcome the principles of the Stage 1 Fgm Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill, and I'm pleased to have the chance to speak in this debate today. Presiding Officer, female genital mutilation is physical and coercive abuse of women and girls. There's no other way to describe it. The word mutilation says it all. Fgm violates the rights of women and girls and has lifelong physical, sexual and mental health implications. It has no health benefits, quite the reverse. It is, of course, illegal and it is abhorrent. As we've heard, the aim of this bill is to strengthen the legal protection for women and girls at risk of the procedure by enabling the court to make an Fgm protection order, a civil order, to protect a person at risk of being subjected to Fgm, and safeguarding them from harm if it's already happened, or reducing the likelihood that Fgm offences will happen. It will be a criminal offence to breach an Fgm protection order. An application can be made by a person at risk, a victim, a local authority, Police Scotland, the Lord Advocate or any other person with the permission of the court. Anyone breaching the order would be committing a criminal offence with a potential prison sentence of up to 5 years. So we know Fgm has been illegal in Scotland since 1985, but to date there have been no criminal prosecutions brought in Scotland, with one being brought in England. Presiding Officer, I think that says it all about the need for this bill. The multi-agency guidance in Fgm reinforces Scotland's child protection guidance, but it is currently advisory. The proposed Fgm protection orders and statutory guidance will complement this system. Although Fgm is an international practice, we in Scotland have a duty of care to those who live here, and this bill will give protection to the most vulnerable. The Law Society's helpful briefing points out that this is not the first step taken by the Scottish Parliament in Fgm. It builds on the Prohibition of Female Genital Mutilation Scotland Act 2005 and implements Scotland's commitment in the National Action Plan to prevent and eradicate Fgm. Its aim is to foster an environment of prevention in Scotland and to provide the welfare and quality of life of Fgm survivors, with a focus on the linked areas of prevention, protecting girls at risk and provision of appropriate support and sensitive services for survivors of Fgm. There's no doubt, Presiding Officer, that communication and education to intervene early are keys to the success of this new bill. In addition, we do need reliable data to determine the exact scale of the problem in Scotland. The Scottish Refugee Council published a report in 2014 estimating the location and number of Scottish communities affected by those who've come from countries practising Fgm to be around 24,000, which provides some indication as to the scale of the issue. Presiding Officer, I have to say that number shocked me and highlights the desperate need to raise awareness of the bill within the relevant cultures and communities. We must overcome language barriers and cultural differences within our public services, such as the NHS and the police, who do a fantastic job of inclusiveness, to simply say, no, this is not acceptable. And I agree with Mary Fee, we must reach girls within the school curriculum as part of our GIRFEC strategy and regard this as a child protection issue. If we can protect girls at an early age by educating them against the dangers of this practice, then issues surrounding older girls and women will be eradicated. There also needs to be clear guidance on how to report issues around a protection order, and we must win the trust of potential victims and communities most at risk, so they know they will be protected in Scotland. Presiding Officer, anonymity is not specifically provided for in the bill, in contrast to the position for victims in England and Wales. So I support the committee's view in the Stage 1 report to ensure that the views and wishes of victims and survivors are paramount, and anonymity on request is a reasonable expectation for victims of FGM. Given the nature of this abuse and the sensitivity surrounding it, I think that anonymity should be included. Access to legal aid for victims is also extremely important, as without this many vulnerable groups may not feel empowered or simply financially able to proceed with legal action. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I want women and girls to live in a world where they feel safe, one where their rights will not be violated and their futures ruined. And I believe this bill, when it reaches Stage 3, will give women and girls that protection. And it will send out a message that Scotland is a country that values all its citizens and is striving to keep them safe with legal protection and support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we move to closing speeches. Elaine Smith to be followed by Miles Briggs. Elaine Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've heard some harrowing stories of women subjected to FGM, and the Minister herself opened with a powerful example. James Dornan also gave an example. And Ruth Maguire asked us not to doubt the stories because they are real. I think that's a very important point that we need to bear in mind. And Annie Wells explained what exactly FGM is, which is important to know but hard to listen to. It's a global issue, and as I said earlier, we can't be complacent about successes in eradicating the practice. And as Maurice Corrie mentioned, it is clearly a form of sex-based violence against women and girls, a point also made by Rona Mackay in her speech. Today, just as in 2005, there is much to be done to challenge the views which normalise the mutilation of mainly girls under the age of 15. Alex Cole-Hamilton made the point about a patriarchal culture, but could I just make the point again that others have made, that there is no religion that actually agrees with FGM or requires it. I think it's important that we note that. In February this year, in response to an FOI request, we heard that NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde and NHS Lothian had treated victims of FGM on more than 230 occasions in 2017-18, figures that were also mentioned in his speech by James Dornan. And it can be difficult, I think, to deal with. So, for example, when women have to be cut open to deliver babies, and then they're asking to be re-sewn because that's all that they have known, then that is a real challenge for people working in the health service, and it's something we have to bear in mind. FGM is now illegal in all EU member countries, but the number of successful prosecutions is still relatively low, with the exception of France. The threat of imprisonment and large fines alone are not enough as a prevention strategy, but the evidence from France also highlights how intrusive and stigmatising prevention strategies can sometimes be, and I think we have to be very, very careful. Here in Scotland, we must refocus our efforts to work with families, communities and community leaders to deliver the necessary information and the benefits of abandoning this barbaric practice, and I think this bill will very much help to do that. I welcome the multi-agency approach of the new legislation, and I note Mary Fee's pleas for education in schools and a consistent approach across services. The committee convener Ruth Maguire made the important point too that when we identify communities where the practice is still prevalent, we must not racialise the issue or victimise people who are already victims themselves. And that is especially relevant when we look at how enablers of FGM, or people who don't report it, are treated. Often they're women who do not have the power or ability to prevent it, and therefore should not be criminalised. We have to give people confidence to discuss, challenge and report the practice, which can be deeply embedded in their traditions. And that's the same as the Equal Opportunities Committee did in 2005. And I think that raises the issue then of anonymity, which both Mary Fee and Rona Mackay spent some time talking about. We then have to give people the support to use the law to either protect themselves or someone else at risk of FGM. And I was very pleased to hear Annie Wells say in the intervention that she took from me that in the case of asylum seekers that she would write to the Westminster Government. Patrick Harvey, Mary Fee and Angela Constance also outlined the issues around the asylum system that need dealt with and challenged, including the language barrier. We must also make sure there are adequate funds to train professionals to apply for the protection orders when they're needed, and I note that support should also be included. That was a point made by many members during the debate. Michelle Ballantyne gave a powerful example of, I think, the need for this during her speech, a powerful personal example. I welcome the more consistent multi-agency response, but I do see service after service stretched to its limits. And I think that can make it difficult for the health service perhaps to provide the services needed. Many services are underfunded, understaffed, and we can add to the additional burdens, and therefore we have to add to their funding and their allocation to back up the strategy. Sadly, I think we can only expect more austerity from Boris Johnson's government in Westminster, but many of the services which will be involved in this prevention strategy are funded by local government, so I would urge the Scottish Government to stop the underfunding of councils in Scotland. Presiding Officer, I don't want to finish on a negative note. I think that this is a debate that unites us all, as some people have said, some members have said, and I know the Minister cares passionately about tackling violence against women and girls. It's a small but important piece of legislation. It enhances the good work that's gone before, and I congratulate Christina McKelvey on her first bill. Can I make the point that in 2005, our legislation here was better than the Westminster legislation, so I just throw that into the mix as well. I thank the committee for their work in scrutinising stage 1 of this bill. And as Mary Fee said, thanks to the women and girls who gave evidence, working together, respecting and listening to the communities involved, I'm sure we will move forward towards the eradication of FGM in Scotland and abroad. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on Miles Biggs to wind up for the Conservative Party.
Officer, and I'm pleased to close today's debate for the Scottish Conservatives, and actually believe it's been a useful constructive and positive debate we've had today, and I thank those organisations who have provided briefings for members, including the Law Society of Scotland. I'm also grateful to the colleagues we've heard today from Parliament's Equalities and Human Rights Committee for producing such a thorough and thoughtful Stage 1 report. In addition, we should also put on record, I believe, praise for the charities working on the front line of this, including the Shakti Women's Aid and Scottish Refugees Council. As my colleague Annie Wells has indicated, Scottish Conservatives very much support the aims of this bill and look to strengthen it as we move through the stages in Parliament. And we will be backing measures to put in place legal and criminal positions that are designed to support victims as effectively as possible and punish and deter those who actually perpetrate these abhorrent practices. FGM protection orders are therefore a major and welcome step forward. Last year, I met with prominent women's rights campaigner Nice Nalente Lingete, who was presented with the People's Postcode Lottery Hero Award in recognition of her work to end FGM in Kenya. The work of the Amref Health Africa UK support charity saw 4 years of dialogue with elders in Nice's village to change literally hundreds of years of culture and abandon cutting of girls in Africa. One of the key things they saw was a surge in the number of girls attending school after that was taken forward. And much of today's debate has rightly focused on how we improve the bill and the committee's constructive recommendations on how we take this forward. As Maurice Corrie outlined, we believe further work in the bill is required, and we've heard that today from a number of members as we look to back calls for the government to set out clearly how we can engage with women involved and communities to develop further guidance and awareness around FGM and these protection orders. The committee specifically asked ministers to address difficulties around prosecutions in light of the fact that there's only ever been one UK prosecution for FGM, and I think that's important going forward. And while reasons for the lack of prosecutions are varied, not least the difficulty in challenging family members and mistaken belief of some professionals, we should look to actually take forward this, and it would be useful as we move towards stage 2 to actually look at that in more detail. And I agree with what Police Scotland, for example, have said around Scottish Government should also give thought to potential gap in legislation to cover when someone is found with items in their possession suggesting their intent to carry out FGM. I think that is something we also need to take forward. There may be merit in considering a preventative offence around intent for possession of items for the purpose of FGM. And I welcome what the Minister had to say on this, and Ministers considering that at stage 2. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, I wanted to again very much welcome the provisions of the bill, especially in relation to the creation of Fgm Protection Orders, which have the potential as such to be a useful tool for our agencies and individuals in taking forward FGM guidance at a statutory level. Communities and professionals must be very closely involved, obviously, in the creation of this guidance. And we very much hope this legislation will play another part in helping to achieve the societal, cultural and attitudinal change necessary to both eliminate FGM here in Scotland, but also to send the message out across the world. I wanted to conclude with Nice's words at that event, where she said, "The practice is devastating for the health, rights and chances of young girls, and we won't stop until every girl in Africa can be the woman of her dreams." As has been said by members across the chamber today, if this legislation we will put forward in Scotland results in just one individual in Scotland not facing the barbaric practice of FGM, it will have been worthwhile, and we support the general principles of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call on the Minister to wind up our debate.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased to close the Stage 1 debate on the Female Genital Mutilation Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill. It's been an excellent debate with absolutely fantastic points raised, and I want to try and get through lots of the points raised. If I don't get to them all today, they're all on my list, don't worry. But I wanted to very quickly run through some of the issues that's been raised. Mary Fee raised a very important issue about how we change culture and we work with men and boys. I'll send her some information on the Changemakers project that we currently fund, which is men working with men and boys to combat FGM in communities. James Donnan raised an issue about summer holidays. Part of the Fgm Protection Order will remove travel documents like passports in order that summer holiday doesn't happen. And Michelle Ballantyne suggested that the Scottish Government is lagging behind of the rest of the UK, maybe in bringing legislation forward. However, we do know there is challenges with the UK Act, and we wanted to take our time to work with communities and consult with them appropriately to get it right the first time, because unintended consequences could have incredibly harmful consequences. Ruth Maguire, Patrick Harvey and Mary Fee and many others raised the issue that came out at committee about racialisation. I want to reassure all of them that we will work closely with stakeholders and others to ensure that we work on the training is cognizant of all of these issues, and we will be guided by communities on the best way to reflect that and the issues in the development of the statutory guidance and the subsequent training. And I'd like to reassure Angela Constance, because she asked whether I would commit to ongoing participation, not just a one-off, and the answer to that is very clear, yes. On guidance and training, let me see, Alec Cole-Hamilton, Angela Constance, Ruth Maguire all talked about a person-centred approach, and to assist with the specific and effective operation of future statutory guidance on FGM, we will work with stakeholders. I can't reference that enough, and Ruth Maguire in raising the digital stories is something that we will take into account to ensure that core training adequately reflects the position of FGM, including the updated legislation too. I want to reassure Elaine Smith in her comments about health experience both in Scotland and England. We've taken a real interest in this, and we've taken that forward, and we're working very closely with our health colleagues when we develop the guidance and the training to ensure that we get that absolutely right. Patrick Harvey talked about lived experience. This is at the heart of everything that we do, and I hear Mary Fee's calls for that universal approach too. Rona Mackay, Alec Cole-Hamilton and others talked about raising awareness, and part of the work of the National Action Plan, we are committed to raising awareness of FGM and the harms it causes. Specifically, we want to ensure that statutory services work with partner agencies and community organisations to raise awareness of the rights of women and children to be free from FGM. I will commit today to working intensively with community-based stakeholders to ensure that awareness of orders and understanding of how to obtain them is front and centres. And both Annie Wells, Maurice Corrie, Alex Cole-Hamilton and others raised the issue around anonymity. We have noted the committee's view that we will respond before stage 2 on this, because it's a very important point, but we note that the committee committee has not recommended automatic lifelong anonymity as articulated by Angela Constance. We've got a justice system in Scotland that's based on justice being open and accessible, and that includes being able to provide anonymity if circumstances justify it. And I think that's the point. If it's a child involved, we do have other statutory provisions that we can use. On the issue around asylum seekers and Fgm protection orders, both Ruth Maguire, Elaine Smith's interventions, because she had a few, Patrick Harvey and Angela Constance. I will be writing to the UK Government on this point. It's an incredibly important point. You would have heard my intervention on Maurice Corrie on that, so I wanted to give some reassurance around those points as well. On legal aid, which is another big issue that came up and many people raised it as well. Again, Annie Wells, Rona Mackay and others raised the issue around legal aid. The majority of cases of Fgm protection orders will be sought by public authorities, so therefore the need for legal aid will not be there. However, if that individual is a child, and legal aid would normally be subject to means testing of the income of the parents, but only where it is not unjust or inequitable to do so. But it's worth noting that in 2018, independent strategic review into legal aid, Rethinking Legal Aid, highlighted Scotland's current legal aid spend per head is a third highest in the European Union. Given that Fgm protection orders would often and not always involve the consideration of restrictions on parents, we think it highly likely that such means testing would always be unjust and inequitable. In these circumstances, legal aid would be granted. And we will continue to engage with the Legal Aid Board and others to ensure these issues are taken into account in implementing the bill. The other issue that was raised quite clearly was around about data collection and recording. The Chief Medical Officer and Chief Nursing Officer issued a letter in July 2014 to help healthcare professionals in the NH recognise Fgm, the services that are most likely to come across the condition, and to record the diagnosis of the types of Fgm in clinical letters. We are working with the Fgm National Action Plan Implementation Group to ensure greater consistency with regard to data collection policies and Fgm across different NHS board areas. Miles Briggs raised the issue that Police Scotland had raised in their evidence to committee, and it may be helpful to note that the circumstances set out by Police Scotland would, I think, be covered in this bill. So if granted, a Type 3 Fgm PO could provide that such items, people who have got an intention to cut, would be prohibited, and they would be prohibited from possessing these, and this would be a criminal offence as well. So hopefully that will reassure Police Scotland in that respect. Presiding Officer, Michelle Ballantyne gave us a very clear picture of what happens when a woman is subject to Fgm. And I wanted to conclude by paying tribute to a very special young activist, Nene Bojang. She lives not that far from this place, and she underwent Fgm at the age of 9. And like Wallace Derry, she is an activist against the practice. I was privileged to launch this bill with her, and that's what I mean about having the lived experience of people right at the heart of this. Can I congratulate Elaine Smith on her long-term commitment to all of this? Because the first time I heard a debate on Fgm was when Elaine Smith spoke about it, I think maybe probably in 2005. Presiding Officer, if this bill, as Nene Bojang told us, even just one woman stops one woman from going through the same thing as me, she said, as me, then in my eyes it will have been a success. Presiding Officer, I think in our eyes that will be a success too. So once again, I commend the general principles of the bill to the Parliament and move the motion in my name. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and that concludes our debate this afternoon. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 20241 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau, setting out a business programme. Could I call on Graham Day to move the motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. No one has asked to speak in the motion. Could I therefore put the question that motion 20241 be agreed? Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. And we turn to decision time. One question this afternoon, which is that motion 20223 in the name of Christina McKelvey on the Female Genital Mutilation Protection and Guidance Scotland Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you very much. That concludes decision time. We're going to move shortly to members' business in the name of James Dornan on financial abuse to be recognised fully as coercive and controlling behaviour. But we'll just have a short pause while members and Minister changes seats.